The sponsor for today's podcast is Sita Eco Mission. Eco Mission is a tool that simplifies compliance, cuts cost, and offers real-time insights to support sustainable operation at airlines. Sita Eco Mission helps airlines handle regulations like Refuel EU, CORSIA, and EU ETS, making compliance easier while supporting better, greener choices. Learn more in the link in the show notes.
If the industry doesn't make progress fast enough, they'll likely be one of the biggest kind of chunks of sources of emissions left because of the complexity of its decarbonization. So that's really me ringing the alarm bells to keep, going down this path and work with governments and work with customers as your business is growing, because as we said, the majority of people in the world haven't been on a plane yet.
Welcome to Sustainability in the Air, the world's first podcast dedicated to sustainable aviation. I'm your host, Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simply Flying. Every Thursday, I have important conversations with top aviation executives, technology entrepreneurs, and policymakers helping aviation take climate action. Conversations that help separate the signal from the noise. Whether you are a frequent flyer or an airline executive, if you care about sustainability or simply love traveling, welcome aboard. I have not one, but two guests with me today from the Clean Air Task Force, a think tank that produces cutting-edge research to inform policy and beyond on making aviation and all of transportation sustainable. Larissa Liebeck is Senior Director, Europe and Middle East for CATF, and Thomas Walker is the Transportation Technology Manager at CATF. We speak about what it's going to take to make aviation sustainable, what are some difficult questions to answer, and how the work that they're doing at CATF informs policy in CO2 emissions and non-CO2 emissions and beyond. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Welcome to the latest edition of the podcast. Today we don't have one, but two amazing guests. We have Liebeck and Tom Walker from the Clean Air Task Force. Lee and Tom, welcome to the show. Can you please tell us exactly what does CATF do and what are your roles with the think tank?
Yeah, thank you so much for having us here. We're really, really excited. My name is Liebeck. I'm the Senior Director for Europe and the Middle East and lead most of our international work. And I just want to say a little bit about Clean Air Task Force before I hand it over to my colleague Tom Walker, who's the actual expert on aviation decarbonization, also released a really, really important report with our colleagues on the topic recently. But to those of you who don't know Clean Air Task Force, we're a global climate organization focused on overlooked solutions for decarbonization and climate mitigation across the energy system. So we focus on emissions reductions in the electricity sector, so clean electricity, industrial decarbonization, and as Tom will talk about, also, of course, transportation decarbonization. And just to go into a little bit more detail, we were founded originally in the United States, focusing on reducing emissions from power plants, and have since expanded globally to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and are also really focused on really next generation solutions. So nuclear fusion and fission, zero carbon fuels, as we'll talk about a lot about today, as well as carbon management technologies and super pollutants. So methane mitigation is really at the heart and core of our work. So, how can we really decarbonize as fast as possible while we're creating a high energy planet with energy access for all? So Tom, over to you to talk about our transportation decarbonization work.
Thanks, Lee. Hi, everybody. My name is Tom Walker. I am the working on the transportation decarbonization team as a transportation technology manager. Our team really focuses on, we focus on all elements of transportation decarbonization, but we put a particular emphasis on the largest vehicles that will be the hardest to electrify. So those are large trucks, marine, and as this podcast is focusing on aviation, we recently, I was the author of a report that I worked on with my other colleagues on that team that focused on all the different difficulties and also opportunities to decarbonize the aviation sector. And I'm happy to get into that in more detail in this podcast today.
Fantastic. Tom, why don't we get started with you, because you recently released a report where it suggested that synthetic fuels could make over half of aviation fuel by 2050 in an optimistic scenario. I find that quite ambitious. What policy measures do you think are necessary to achieve this level of synthetic fuel adoption and production?
Yeah, so that was one of the few scenarios that we looked at in that paper. And the idea was that how could we actually go about decarbonizing such an energy intensive sector by 2050? And the solutions that you most commonly hear about are biofuels. These are fuels that use, bio feedstocks like corn or soy. You can turn that into a jet fuel. And since those crops originally absorb the CO2, that's the net zero process. But there's not likely to be enough biofuel. You need some other types of fuels because if you're planting crops for fuel, then you have less crops you're planting for food, right? So there's a balance there. So you need to look at other options. And one of the options we looked at in our scenarios were these synthetic fuels, which are fuels where you've taken CO2 from the air, from direct air capture, and then you combine that with hydrogen, you synthesize a hydrocarbon. And in the scenario that looked at when you really focused on synthetic fuels, yes, we got over 50% of aviation fuel. And the advantage to using these synthetic fuels in this optimistic scenario is this is a drop-in fuel. We don't need to change the infrastructure. There's still going to be a kerosene-like fuel, and that makes it quite easy to adopt. On the other hand, it's going to be expensive. And so the way we would ramp this up is a couple of things. We need a lot of hydrogen for these fuels. And so we need to ramp up the clean hydrogen market. So that's 45V, which is part of the infrastructure, the IRA bill, and also the hydrogen hubs. So I think recently I've started to get awards from the DOE. Those are both U.S. focused programs, but those are designed to provide subsidies, tax subsidies for the hydrogen, designed to really increase the amount of hydrogen production. That's half of our synthetic fuels that we need to ramp up. And then the other half is on the CO2 side. Where are we going to get climate-friendly CO2? The most common option is to pull it from the air with direct air capture. That's also expensive. So we need to ramp that up as well. So we need to have investments into those technologies. And then another thing we're thinking about on the policy side is something like a clean fuel standard. It's basically a standard where if you produce fuel that is below a target, and you're below that, we'll give you a credit. If you're above that, you have to then buy credits. And it creates a market where you can trade credits for the cleaner fuels, and the dirtier fuels need to buy those credits to incentivize people to make cleaner fuels. And then you drop that target over time such that you get close to zero. And so that will also incentivize cleaner fuels like synthetic fuels. So those types of policies, I think, can ramp up these markets so we can hopefully by mid-century get up to those ambitious numbers of having over 50% of fuels be synthetic.
Wow. Thank you for running it down exactly how this works. I have to ask you at this point, you mentioned the IRA, you mentioned the DOE, the Department of Energy in the US, both of which have been huge supporters. Now, I believe your key assumption here is, regardless of what happens, the benefits from the IRA and the approach of the DOE does not change regardless of who is in the president's office in the US. Is that a big risk here?
It's somewhat of a risk. I admittedly, I have colleagues that are much more invested in kind of the politics side. My boss, Jonathan Lewis, is often in DC, kind of working these angles and trying to get, things like the clean fuel standard, actually into law. There is some risk here, but we also think that it's more of a kickstart. A lot of these markets just kind of have to get them rolling, because once there's money to be made in the private industry for hydrogen, you can imagine that this market will kind of, regulate itself and start to grow on its own. And so it's just these first few years. So there's some risk with that, but it's really just, I think, getting it started. And if we can get it started effectively, I think that we can bring enough money into the market that can kind of, take over with usual market and economic dynamics.
Yeah, I would also say there's always political risk, especially in a year like 2025, where there's elections all over the world. And that could change. But I think what we're trying to really accomplish is that the political economy is balance for solutions across and durable political spectrum, and that really communities also see the benefits of clean energy and clean fuel production. And so, for example, there's plans for synthetic fuels production in places like Texas, which I think is a good example of a diverse political economy, if that makes sense.
I think Texas is a good example of. I believe Texas has installed more solar panels in the last 1 year than the entire country of Canada in its history. So I think there's definitely progress. And you make a good point around kickstarting. This is about kickstarting the policies rather than relying upon them being constant throughout. We talked about synthetic fuels. What about biofuels? You have cautioned against the over-reliance on biofuels or HEPA-based fuels. Can you discuss some of the limitations you see with scaling up SAF from biomass sources?
Yeah, so there's two issues here. One, you spoke about how much sustainable biofuel than we truly have. And then the other is aviation has grown year over year for decades. It dipped during the pandemic, but now it's growing again, and we expect that to continue out to 2050. And so as your aviation demand grows, we think that it's going to be very challenging for biofuel production to keep up with that growth. We expect it to grow some, but some of the issues you start to run into when, as I kind of briefly mentioned before, is that you end up taking natural areas, natural grasslands and forests and converting them into croplands. And those natural areas absorb CO2 at a different rate than if you're actually farming them. That's one problem. And another problem is the effect on the food markets. And are we putting indirect pressure on those markets by planting more crops that are being used for biofuel? And so we see that, aviation, to keep up with the aviation market, biofuel production might need to increase by a factor of 6 by mid-century. And we think that's unrealistic. Maybe it increases by a factor of 2 or 3, which is still a lot, but that will still leave about half of the aviation demand uncovered, right? And that's where synthetic fuels, hydrogen, and maybe something more exotic like ammonia come in. So it's more about not trying to put undue pressure on some of these markets and reaching into unsustainable biofuels, which have other climate implications that we don't think are good.
Let's talk about costs then. It definitely costs a lot more to have synthetic fuels or produce synthetic fuels rather than biofuels. As it is, airlines have jet fuel as about 30% of their costs. If we are talking about HEFA-based biofuels, SAF, let's say 2x the price of normal jet fuel, that's 60%. You're talking about synthetic fuels. Currently, I think they're 6 to 8x the cost of jet fuel. Of course, they will come down over time. But how do you factor in this green premium, and who's going to pay for it?
That's a really good question. I think that to start, we're going to need some sort of subsidies or policy to kind of get us over that initial hump as we try to bring some of these markets online. Because really, we talk about these different options, and HEFA has existed for a while, and that there's a little momentum with, synthetic sustainable aviation fuel and starting to blend some of that in. So that market's kind of getting going. And there's also a lot of different uses for biofuels in other sectors as well. So there's synergy there. For synthetic fuels, which, as you say, are much more expensive, at least 5 times, if not more expensive than conventional Jet A, the market is very new. For the paper, we talked to 2 or 3 different, really just getting started, one plant in Texas, one plant in Chile type, really ground level. And so the cost always is going to be really, really high then. And so getting us over that hump, I think we're going to need policy to push us that direction. Because yes, right now it would be something, whether it's certain airlines or certain routes that people are willing to pay more for, or if it's some sort of, this is an economic model might need to be developed around this point to try to get people to participate. Maybe it's an opt-in, but there are several different things we've talked about over the years. For one example, not from aviation, but from shipping, was the idea that a bunch of companies got together, large companies that you would have heard of, Nikes or Amazons. They'll agree to pay more for shipping on clean fuels like methanol or ammonia. And if the companies all agree, there can be some enough demand rather, so that the price can be kept down in the meantime. So there's a few different options that you can explore to try to solve this issue at the beginning before the market takes off.
Let's talk about another fuel type, which is hydrogen. you have talked about the potential for hydrogen-powered aircraft, particularly for regional flights. How do you see the timeline for commercial deployment of hydrogen aircraft evolving?
Hydrogen aircraft are really, really interesting because the idea of powering an aircraft with a fuel that doesn't have any carbon at all is very appealing. You don't have to even, it's not about net zero. It's zero from the start. There's some challenges with that though. And one of those challenges is that you have to, redesign and recertify the aircraft. Hydrogen would need to be stored in like tanks, like cylindrical tanks, where right now fuel is stored in the wings. And so you would have to have those tanks. Where do you put them? Do you put them in the seating area where then you have less passengers? And so that's one of the reasons why shorter flights look better for hydrogen, because you don't need as much fuel on board. You can preserve more space for seating. However, there are some advantages with hydrogen. We were speaking about synthetic fuels earlier. And one of the interesting things is that per mile flown, synthetic fuels require 1.6 more kilograms of hydrogen to make than if I had just flown on hydrogen itself. So you use much more fuel. You have to produce more hydrogen. It costs you more money. The ticket prices are higher, like we were saying before. So in theory, if you could actually fly on hydrogen, you would save yourself, money and hassle. But the getting to that step is much more arduous. Hydrogen is not a drop-in fuel. You need to make all of the infrastructure, airports, and you need to be able to handle hydrogen. You'll be dealing with liquid hydrogen, which is liquid at negative 253 Celsius, whereas kerosene is liquid at, room temperature. And so there's challenges there that we have to get over, but there's also opportunity. If you were, for example, to push hydrogen for regional flights along with using sustainable aviation fuel for the longer flights, you could reduce how much hydrogen you need per year by over 50 million tons. That saves a lot of money. And so we think that, a standard, like I mentioned, the clear fuel standard, to just reward any kind of fuel, fuel agnostic, and so long as the carbon intensity is below your target, can really help push these more novel fuels like hydrogen. Timeline wise, our large companies like Airbus have talked about 2035. That's pretty ambitious, but it's possible. There are some small hydrogen planes that are being tested now, small, like 10-seat type planes that are being tested. But I would say late 2030s, early 2040s, I think we'll start to see the first few planes come into the fleet. By mid-century, I think we'll have, these regional flights, maybe 10%, 15%, a small number might be covered by hydrogen planes. But it's really promising technology.
You mentioned a few interesting challenges there. I remember working on introducing the A380 about 10 years ago with Airbus. And I remember working with a few airports where they had to only add a buffer to the side of the runway because the wingspan was a bit bigger. And that was a hard job. Some airports had to make special A380 gates for the double decker, and that was a hard job. Here for hydrogen, we're talking about storage, transportation, a new aircraft design. I mean, this is rethinking aviation from the ground up. Do you really think this is possible, especially given the recent implosion of universal hydrogen?
It's a really big challenge. I was speaking to San Francisco Airport for the paper, talking to them about these different fuel types and how much investment were they putting into electric aircraft and how much they were putting into hydrogen. They were concerned about how many infrastructure changes it would need and spoke about things where they have like a special hydrogen terminal or section that's just purpose built for handling these new fuels, and how much money it would cost, billions of dollars, to renovate the airport to handle these types of fuels. But also they said that they thought the solution was just time and kind of introducing these fuels early. For example, they mentioned that they were trying to just bring in hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, just so like for their ground equipment, just so that they could their operators could get used to handling gaseous hydrogen and kind of have a slow ramp up on this such that they could get used to handling it, trial small amounts rather than just jumping right to having hydrogen aircraft. But as you say, it's a major challenge. You would need gate redesigns. You would need to have all the fuel lines would need to be, remanaged and checked for leaks, which is another major hydrogen issue. Hydrogen, being the smallest element in the universe, easily leaks. And if you have leaking hydrogen, it's also extremely flammable. So you can imagine that we were talking today about the crisis with the check-in system. Imagine if you had a hydrogen leak at an airport, how much that would shut things down, right? So lots of different infrastructure would need to be built. Lots of different systems would need to be added. But I think the airports are trying to get started early and just to kind of start a slow ramp up rather than trying to jump to it in the mid 2030s. And I think that's the best way. Just experience and time will help cut the mountain as you were with the difficulty of this.
Thank you so much for playing along with me and diving a little deeper into the hydrogen challenges. We spoke about SAF, we spoke about hydrogen. What about ammonia? Because that's something the Clean Air Task Force has emphasized. Do you envision a role for ammonia as a potential fuel source? What advantages or challenges do you see with ammonia compared to other fuels?
Ammonia is a really polarizing topic, actually. We've been interested in ammonia as a fuel for quite a while, mostly for shipping.
Other than the fact that it stinks.
Yeah, right. That is.
I remember that from a chemistry lab.
One of the biggest pushbacks we've gotten with ammonia, actually, on ships, is that since it smells and it's toxic, so the shipfarers are like, well, what if something leaks in the engine room? What are we going to do? And so, but from a purely technical standpoint, ammonia is really, really interesting for aviation, for shipping, is because it solves one of the issues with hydrogen is that it's liquid at negative 33°C, which is cold, but that's not cryogenic. They have to spend a lot of energy keeping it cold. And so it's much easier to handle. And since it's NH3, so I have 3 hydrogens now in there, it actually has more hydrogen per liter than liquid hydrogen itself, just because the density of liquid hydrogen is so low. Ammonia is much higher. You can pack more of it, and it solves on the airplane, it solves your energy density problem. So you're saying that hydrogen is kind of limited for regional flights because of the tanks you need to have on board. But ammonia, since it's liquid at a reasonable temperature, you can store it in the wings like we do with kerosene now. And you could cover about 75% of domestic U.S. flights, which for some smaller countries, like over the EU, will cover the entire country. And so it has much more energy on board. It solves the handling problem. And that also there's no carbon, so you don't have the GHG emissions. But as we said, the downside is really the toxicity. There's a lot of concern about that for passenger ferrying operations. I can imagine that this maybe first gets introduced for cargo first, just so you can kind of work the systems out and make sure everything is leak tight. And also, you would need major recertification efforts. Even if the plane will probably look more visually similar, it might have less of the problems we spoke about changing the airport, at least on like the gate size, runway size. You would still need specialized ammonia infrastructure, specialized ammonia handling. And the biggest issue really is that this technology is much newer. Liquid hydrogen we spoke about maybe is 2035, 2040. This is at least 10 years behind that, maybe more. The people I talked to were still working on the technology at the university level, albeit sponsored by NASA, GE, and Boeing. So there's a lot of interest in this, but it's still new. And if this even comes to pass, we're looking at past 2045, 2050. It's at least 10 years behind hydrogen. But it's got some promise there, but problems need to be solved. People need to get comfortable with it, really.
Is ammonia drop-in like SAF, or does it require modifications in aircraft?
You need to modify the engine to, without getting too far into the weeds, you would basically modify the engine. You would separate the nitrogen from the hydrogen, and you actually burn the hydrogen by itself. So you need a specialized engine that did this process. But the aircraft itself, though, it would still be a kind of tube and wings, feel in the wings. So it'll look visually similar. But the interior of the engine would need to be redesigned, which is what they're working on at the university level. Okay.
Finally, still, sort of the round up all the technology side of things, you emphasize the need for a mix of technologies to decarbonize aviation. What about electric aircraft? How do you see electric aircraft fitting in the mix, given the limitations on battery energy density?
Exactly. That's the really tricky thing about electrification. Electricity is great because out of all of the options, it's by far the most energy efficient. Efficiencies with batteries are in the 90%, where if you're combusting something, it's like 40 or 50 at best. But the problem is, while that works great for your person or passenger vehicle, for an airplane, you do have a hard time getting enough energy on board because of the low energy density of batteries. So if we were trying to duplicate a regional plane like we were speaking about for hydrogen, you would need around 750 watt hours per kilogram battery. That's 3 times more than the best batteries we have today. So we're well short of that. And so what we've seen to date with these batteries is short, small planes. So maybe 5 to 10 seats, 200 or 300 miles. If you're making a very short hop, I can imagine in the future, maybe like Boston to New York. That's short enough that maybe in the future we might have electric aircraft. But then for the longer flights, it gets really, really difficult. And so when you're looking at these really short lane, small flights, that's only around 4% of departures, 5% of departures now, without a big increase in, a big advancement rather in battery technology. And so as such, we don't see this playing a major role by 2050. Maybe further out, we can imagine there being kind of a unexpected technology development. The biggest thing that we see is maybe in intra-city, so inside the urban areas, EV tolls or air taxis kind of replacing helicopters or some sort of technology like that being replaced, combustion technology being replaced with electric vehicles. The airport I spoke to, San Francisco Airport, was looking at EV tolls as for very short hops inside of San Francisco, for example, replacing some on-road emissions. So there might be some of that we see. But for longer flights, I think it's going to be a struggle for the next several decades for battery-powered airplanes.
Yeah, I think we can start with Boston to Cape Cod first.
Yeah, man, that's
all the way.
That's a long drive around the Cape. I would appreciate a EV.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. You and I can take that together then. Let's talk about GREET. And I would love for you or Lee to explain to the audience what GREET is, because you raised concerns about GREET underestimating indirect land use change emissions for SAF. What changes would you like to see to make how these emissions are calculated?
So GREET is the Department of Energy's, or rather I should say the Argonne National Laboratory, which is a big national lab in the U.S., tool that they've been developing for a long time, since the mid-90s, for a life cycle analysis. It stands for Greenhouse Gases, Regulated Emissions, and Energy Use and Technologies. So GREET. There's a very complex tool that looks at the life cycle emissions from a wide range of technologies. Hydrogen, electricity, biofuels are in there, all sorts of different methods and feedstocks. And it is, since it's an Argonne National Lab tool, it's been kind of the go-to for a lot of these, policies that have been rolled out in the U.S., like the IRA, for example. And it's frequently updated because there's new knowledge that comes out, new technologies are introduced, and there's more learning about how different feedstocks, and what their climate impact is. And one of the things that has become a challenge with GREET is how you look at indirect land use change that comes from biofuels, like we were talking about before. If you're planting a bunch of crops for biofuels, you're then either getting rid of natural lands and forests and replacing them with croplands. You're taking different types of crops that are used for food and replacing them with fuel. And the carbon intensity, or really the ability of that land to absorb carbon from the air, is affected by what's on it. And so that's known as indirect land use change. And the current updates to GREET, we feel that don't properly account for this. There are other tools besides GREET. EPA has their own tool. There's a tool that's used in Europe called Corsia a lot. And those indirect land use change numbers are much higher. And we feel that, Argonne needs to bring their tool to be more in line with what these other tools are saying. And I won't go too far into the weeds. It has to do with how you convert the land and what assumptions they make. And we think that they should, was a couple options. We don't think that they should just put their finger on the scale and shift the numbers, right? Things need to be based on data. It needs to be empirical data about how those effects, indirect land use effects, should be accounted for. But a lot of those effects depend on what land you're on, what's the region like, what's the overall climate in that region. It might be different for the Western United States than it is in the UK, for example. And so there's a lot of variables in this. And we think in the meantime, the best way to handle this is just use GREET with other tools, averaging out the numbers with Corsia and GREET and the EPA. Just take an average value for these really difficult challenges or things to measure, like the indirect land use change. Because if you do that, then you reduce reliance on a single set of assumptions. You've got to spread to multiple sets of assumptions. And that can kind of help average out some of those error in the meantime before the model can actually get better and improve.
It's very interesting. I wish there could be just one global standard rather than multiple models from different regions. Just we could all agree on it. CATF has advocated for including CO2 transport via multiple modes, not just pipelines, in the 10T regulation. There's a lot of jargon here. What do you mean by multiple modes? What is the 10T regulation? And why is this important for carbon capture and storage deployment?
Yeah, absolutely happy to talk a little bit about this, because carbon management technologies are actually close to my heart. And really form an important piece of Clean Air Task Force's work, particularly in industrial decarbonization. But as we have heard from Tom, CO2 is actually an important input of synthetic fuel production. And so carbon management as such is really, really important for CO2 sourcing, for example, for alternative aviation fuels. And so, when we're thinking about scaling carbon management technologies at the Clean Air Task Force, we're really thinking through what the infrastructure footprint looks like. So you have to capture the CO2 at the source. You have to transport it to where it can be used or permanently stored. And it's really, really important that when we're thinking of the different industrial facilities that have to be decarbonized with carbon management technologies, they're all over the place and they might not be co-located with utilization or CO2 storage. So it's really important to enable transportation. While pipelines are, of course, the preferred method of transporting CO2, other option enable access to CO2 capture and storage or carbon management as a decarbonization mechanism, such as, for example, by ship or by barge. This can also be, for example, as a temporary method for enabling the CO2 or the carbon management value chain to really prosper. And so we advocated in the 10T regulation, which is really the Trans-European energy regulation focused on transport, to include multiple modes of CO2 transportation, because we wanted to make sure that CO2 capture and CO2 storage or utilization projects have access to as many options as possible. And often these are, of course, cross-border projects, which is what really 10T as a regulation focuses on, of mutually beneficial and cross-border systems. And so I think for us, what's really, really important for us is just to make sure that we have all the different options to realize infrastructure in time. So I'll stop here and invite you, Tom, to talk a little bit more about CO2 or carbon management's role as well.
Yes, as you put, Lee, it's critically important that we have a CO2 market that can really serve as a feedstock for these sustainable aviation fuels and the synthetic fuels in particular. And there's lots of different technologies that we're looking at that can provide that CO2, but that's a really critical market. And you mentioned options as well, and we're going to need several different options to decarbonize aviation, and so we don't want to cut any of those off. And by not, having the CO2 we need and not being able to move it around, whether it's by pipeline or some other approach in the earlier days, that will cut off one of those options. And so, yes, I agree with that. And that is really a critical part.
It's very interesting to hear this in depth, by the way, because I don't think many listeners would typically have knowledge about how this actually works. The other aspect is you have emphasized an options-based approach to decarbonization. What do you mean by an options-based approach, and why is this important?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. And this really lies at the heart of Clean Air Task Force's work, right? I think from our perspective, we need as many decarbonization options as possible so each country or region can decarbonize and transform its energy system with the solutions that are most suited for its individual geographic, resource, and economic circumstances. So, as I said earlier, CATF really focuses on overlooked solutions. And as part of this, we're really focused on creating options for clean electricity, as I mentioned, transportation, as Tom mentioned, or industrial decarbonization. And the idea behind optionality is also really to have a portfolio of solutions. So the more options we have, the more, and if any one of them fails, the more likely we have fallback options, right? And so let's take an example in the EU. According to the current targets, member states need to more than double their renewables capacity over the past couple decades in just 7 years. But, there's permitting challenges, installation rates, are lagging. There is land use footprint questions. And so it's really important to think through, okay, can we actually just double down on what's already been done, or should we explore other solutions? So that's really, really important. And from our perspective, so far climate action has really been focused on, negotiating and kind of struggling over solutions. And it's really, really important that we adopt an options-based approach as soon as possible to really mitigate if one of the solutions can't scale as we anticipated, because it also takes time for new solutions to scale. So it took, solar, for example, 30 years to move from lab to market, and then another for 20 years for commercial uptake. The last thing that I want to say that I think, Tom has already explained really well, the same goes for, of course, aviation decarbonization. It will likely be a portfolio of options that will help decarbonize this sector, which is, by the way, growing. The majority of people have not been on the plane. So the inputs will grow as we're expecting more efficiency from the energy system overall. So I think there's some trade-offs here that are really important. But Tom, maybe over to you. Maybe you have your own spin on this.
The growth of the aviation market is definitely something that we've been looking at. A lot of projections have it 1.5 or 2% per year continuing up. And so we'll have to have lots of different fuel options if we're going to be able to handle that growth. And another thing that Lee mentioned that was really, really interesting is the timescales that were involved here. It takes a long time to decarbonize these markets. It takes a long time for the technology to actually reach maturity. But also something like an airplane is in service for a very long time. These planes are in service for 30 or 40 years sometimes. And over that time period, if you introduce a new plane to the fleet in the late 2030s, it's probably going to still be flying in the 2040s or 2050s. And so we need to have as many options on the table now, and so that we can start this decarbonization effort so we don't get caught with a situation where some of the fleet can't be decarbonized for this reason or that because we foreclosed an option early. So we don't want to try to pick a winner. We don't want to get caught building a bridge to nowhere. We also want to make sure that we can decarbonize and start early on this process. And that's why we need a lot of options.
Fair enough. If you were to advise a startup on options, startups typically need to be focused. If they go in with a bunch of options, or here's my entire fleet, what do they focus on? I mean, isn't this a dichotomy there?
Yeah, that's a very good point. That is, if you're dealing with a really small scale, if you try to apply that to too many things at once, then you're going to end up, you have runway problems in kind of the practical sense. And also you're not focused, like you said. And to a certain extent, we have seen that a little bit with some of these very small aviation, for example, hydrogen, plane companies. I think Universal Hydrogen had some issues recently.
Well, they've gone under.
Yeah, they've gone out. Yeah, that's definitely an issue. And we've seen, really narrowly focused on, for example, small C electric aviation as well, and so I think it's less about one startup trying to handle a lot of things and more that a large number of startups targeting specific areas. We talked to synfuel or synthetic fuel manufacturers for aviation. There was a lot of different small companies that were kind of tackling the problem from a different way, a different synthetic fuel process, how they made the fuel. And they were looking at certain technologies, and other companies were looking at different technology, a different way to approach the same problem, just in case one of those synthetic fuel pathways, production pathways didn't work out, right? So I think that when you're having a nascent industry like this, it's more about lots of startups attacking it, each taking their own route and kind of developing the options that way to kind of mitigate the focus issue you brought up. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Lee.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Tom. And really important question. I would just also say that we need a range of companies to really investigate and support innovation and hand in hand with the government, right? So I think a healthy innovation ecosystem is important, but then also to enable learnings along the way, right? It's never most of the time that, or almost never, that innovation happens very linearly, right? There's some that will kind of revolutionize the process in the beginning, and then there will be cost efficiencies and new processes and new kind of technical ways of approaching the issue along the way. And so I think it's really, really important to think of optionality, not just as technology options, but also within the process itself. We want to have optionality of suppliers, of production processes, of even policies, because not every single policy works for every single project. Because, when it comes to emissions reductions, we often forget that they're not realized when we set targets, but they're realized when we actually get a solution to scale. And so, right, really thinking through what different options are. So project developers and technology developers have options to access innovation funding is really, really important. So it's really a multi-dimensional concept, if that makes sense.
It does indeed. And thank you for, diving a bit deeper and explaining, how this works. Last few questions, Lee. You've talked about the importance of partnerships for decarbonization. What are some of the big barriers when we look at technological partnerships as well as international collaboration on clean energy innovation? Do you see some bright spots that you can lead us to and some of those who have overcome challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for this question. I think in general, I will say that collaboration is hugely important because innovation globally, in theory, has to happen only once. You take the technology to market, like say what Germany and Denmark have done for solar and wind, and of course the UK, and then the technology can kind of spread globally. Plus, you're also then harvesting competitive advantages globally and integrating supply chains in the most efficient ways to reduce cost. I will say that the world has been changing, particularly since the Paris Agreement has been signed, right? So if you think about really climate action, the costs really developed at the peak of multilateralism, and where international collaboration was really rising. And so with the increasing fragmentation of the world over the past years, particularly economic crisis, more kind of trade tensions, if not outright warfare. Also thinking through, of course, geopolitical tensions and all-out conflict and war makes collaboration increasingly difficult. What I will say is that there have been positive moments still over the past couple of years. And there is a robust set of international fora beyond the Conference of the Parties, which happens every year in the winter, such as the Clean Energy Ministerials and the G7, the G20, and other fora to really robustly collaborate. What we would like to see from governments is that they understand that climate is a long-term problem that really needs to be addressed with strategic planning and solutions approach. And so what we would like to see from governments is that they collaborate outside of these structures on climate. And I think if we're talking aviation, again, it's a really, the skies are global, right? And I think are the epitome of the notion that climate change is a global problem. So really, I think what we'd like to see on this front from governments is harmonization and alignment, regulatory alignment, especially when it comes to the definition of what constitutes sustainable aviation fuels, what constitutes, mandates, so that also the private sector can kind of align and adjust to what governments are asking for. Right now, we're seeing this popping up, but I think a bigger alignment push would be helpful. Tom, I don't know if you want to add anything on this.
Actually, before Tom jumps in, I have to ask you, let's talk about COPs. You mentioned the COP conferences. Sometimes, at least watching from an industry perspective, I feel that the baseline that everyone agrees upon is such a low bar. Is it really pushing the industry forward in, yes, we want to seek alignment and we want everyone to agree, but in getting everyone to agree, we're just getting the bare minimums as agreements. Does that really push the boundary at all?
Yeah, happy to talk a little bit about the COPs. I think, as I mentioned, the world has been changing, and so the COPs will be changing, right? I think trying to get everyone on the same page and at the same speed and on the same timelines is actually not the best use of our time. It's really, really important to establish a baseline and push this, but at the same time, what has become really important at the COPs is the so-called action agenda, which is where country and even like cross-sector collaboration, such as governments, governments, companies, NGOs have come together to collaborate on specific solutions. And so what we've seen over the past couple of years are really pledges that have varying coalitions of countries supporting them. So, for example, the Global Methane Pledge, the Carbon Management Challenge, the commitment to triple nuclear power, renewables to double energy efficiencies, the oil and gas decarbonization charter. I think what's now really important is to take those pledges and create kind of stock-taking mechanisms that we're actually moving forward with their implementation. So that means mobilizing financing. That means mobilizing really, goals where countries come back together and show what they have done. There have been initiatives around aviation on this front as well, First Movers Coalition, for example, and others. And I think what's really important is to keep pushing the envelope. And I think what I'd be curious personally on hearing from the industry is what can they actually do? What could they bring together collectively to the COPs and say, this is, a realizable goal given, the industry, of course, has very low margins, is, affected by fuel prices globally, and of course has long-lasting infrastructure. But what can they do over certain timeframes? I think that would be my challenge for the industry. But yeah, maybe back to you, but maybe over to Tom, what his challenge is.
Yeah, I think on COP, you really, really covered it. But just kind of zooming in a little bit on how that works when you drill down from the international collaboration level more down to where the smaller industry players are and the technological partnerships that come from that kind of high level. Because one of the things that we've heard when CATF has talked with some of these smaller players in the aviation space, even up to the larger players, is that when the international stage is changing, the regulations aren't clear, or they're changing a lot, or something is like a life cycle analysis tool. Which tool are you actually using? What are the governments actually saying? That adds a lot of uncertainty, and that filters down to the lower levels, to the smaller industry players, and really having a strong partnership. Really, having clear and targets and goals set out and clear mandates set out. I think that kind of strong partnership really helps this decarbonization effort move more quickly. When there's a lot of uncertainty, it's hard to invest, like we were speaking earlier about the small company who has to be focused. It's difficult to be focused when up top, coming down from the international or a level, there's a lot of uncertainty. So I think that as the world has changed, like Lee mentioned, really refocusing what the overarching goals are will help aviation decarbonize more efficiently.
Fantastic. Well, let me bring in the industry perspective. The one thing that gives me hope from within aviation industry is how traditional competitors are coming together to take action from airlines. So if you look at the United Airlines Ventures Fund, the SAF fund that they've created, they're working with competitors, not just traditional partners. So everyone from Alaska Airlines to Hawaiian Airlines is a partner, or JetBlue is a partner in that United Airlines front. If you look at manufacturers, you've got the likes of Airbus, which has launched a SAF fund where GE, Qantas Airlines, and a lot of companies you wouldn't think traditionally who have worked together are coming together. Or in fact, GE, RTX, and Airbus have come together to talk about non-CO2 effects and urge governments to work on it. So that's the one big thing that gives me a sense of hope from within the aviation industry, and I think that's really good. Where I would love to see action is governments and aviation industry working better together, where the industry is consulted on, let's say, SAF mandates, or the industry inputs are sought for developing green hydrogen in a country rather than trying to move molecules physically necessarily, or developing systems like book and claim. We spoke about it earlier. So it's fantastic to hear about the work CATF is doing. I think think tanks play a very important role in informing governments and society at large. And I think you're doing a good job. Lee, do you have final words to add?
Yeah, I mean, you're touching on such an interesting subject here, what the industry can do, and I totally agree with you, right? I think what's really, really important is governments and industry and nonprofits slash think tanks and academia working hand in hand to really, what we're often seeing in the climate policy space is, policymakers draw something up that was potentially proposed, but not really vet it with the industry, and then we're kind of getting into a stalemate where industry can't deliver because the policy isn't technically sound or is too ambitious, right? Let's not have perfect the enemy of the good. It's really important that we make incremental progress on reducing emissions. And so especially in the aviation industry where infrastructure is long live, that's really, really important. And I also want to say that I've seen very positive momentum also on business model innovation, because cost is a huge question. It's a very low margin business, right? And the biggest question is who's actually going to pay for what. And so some of the big airlines actually have people dedicated to thinking through what's the intersection of customers versus decarbonization solution. Is there a market segmentation because of customer preference? And so I was recently learning about this and was really, really positively surprised by how creatively companies the aviation industry and airlines are thinking about this as well. So I just wanted to add that as a positive note.
Thank you. Lee and Tom, what gives you the most hope about the future of sustainable aviation specifically, not just transport?
I'll start and just say that I think that a lot of it just kind of piggybacking off of what Lee said about it's some of the creative solutions I've seen, and that has then prompted some of these smaller startups to get involved. And that's also been filtering up into some of the policy design and really having a coalition that's not just industry, it's not just think tanks or NGOs, it's the government or as well in that dialogue back and forth where everyone's trying to determine which is the best way to incentivize the behaviors that get us there most efficiently and at a lower cost. And that I've seen an increase in that collaboration over the past few years, and overall recognition that aviation is a really major challenge. We've seen a lot of effort put into light duty vehicles. We've put a lot of effort put now into like trucks and ships. But I think aviation, partly because it's been so difficult and partly because it's just not in forefront. Sometimes you see a plane in the sky, but you see cars all over the roads, right? And so it hasn't been as much of a focus of attention before, but in the recent past 3 to 5 years, I've seen the intention increase, and that gives me a lot of hope that we are going to actually get started on this problem early. We've seen some of the earlier players come in, so we can develop a CO2 capture market. We can develop a clean hydrogen market. We can look at other exotic fuels like ammonia and some of the things we talked about earlier. All that has to start earlier because, as Lee said, the infrastructure is so long-lived that if we don't get started now, we won't. It'll be 20, 60, or 70, 80 before we actually solve the problem. So seeing the attention really shift to aviation recently has really given me a lot of hope.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Tom. I think really starting early on this problem and having, I think really the CEOs, I was recently at a conference that brought together a lot of CEOs from the airline space, be really attentive and really thoughtful about climate change as a problem is, I think, a very, very important sign, because that actually means that it can flow down from there into the business rather than something that has to be pushed up from bottom up into in the companies. I think the strategic investments that have been made, for example, in the first ever megaton direct air capture facility, as well as some of the kind of business model innovation that we already talked about, is really really important. What I really want to emphasize is that because this is really, really important to kind of progress at pace, because and Tom outlines this in his really important report on aviation decarbonization that he and our colleagues have released recently, is that if the industry doesn't make progress fast enough, they'll likely be one of the biggest kind of chunks of sources of emissions left because of the complexity of its decarbonization. So that's really me ringing the alarm bells to keep, going down this path and work with governments and work with customers as your business is growing, because as we said, the majority of people in the world haven't been on a plane yet, is really, really important.
Fantastic, Lee. I think you summed it up very nicely. There is definitely urgency to move towards decarbonization and fast. And I'm delighted to hear all of the details we went into from a think tank perspective and all the policy work that you're doing. Congratulations on the good work, and thank you very much. Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainability in the Air. Aviation is one of the hardest to decarbonize industries, yet there are multiple paths to get to net zero. Awareness is key to a green future. So please give us your support to help our sustainable aviation insights reach a wider audience. You can do this by sharing this episode on your network, on LinkedIn, Twitter, or even WhatsApp. Or perhaps you might consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to this episode. You can start a conversation with us by writing to us at podcast@simpliflying, that's simply with an i.com. And for more content on sustainable aviation, please visit our website green.simplifying.com and join the movement. Sustainability in the Air is an original podcast by Simplifying. The show is produced by Juraj Toth in Slovakia. Dirk Singer is our Director of Sustainability, who leads research for each interviewee out of Greenwich, UK. Shubhadeep Pal is our Supervising Editor based out of Mumbai and Singapore. The articles are written by Ayushi Badola in Dehradun in India and Mira Hull in Montreal, Quebec. Creative design is led by Lihia Esteve in Montreal. Baiba Driman is the project director for the show based out of Valencia, Spain. Special thanks to Wendy Sim in Singapore. And I'm Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying and your host. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.